All right, everybody. So we're going to go ahead and get started. Just want to make sure this is recording. Great. So we've looked at chapter 4, which is law of demand. We've looked at chapter 5, law of supply, and you can see both of these concepts demonstrated graphically here. So with law of demand, you can see that as the price goes down, the demand is going to increase. The quantity demanded increases, this negative relationship here, negative slope. And then you also see with the law of supply is as the price goes up, more and more people are going to be encouraged to purchase that item or actually produce that item. And so they're going to want to increase their supply levels. And so this is always going to be a positive slope here. And so when you look at a business wanting to create something and a consumer wanting to purchase something, ultimately when they meet the tipping point where people actually purchase items from producers, is at this equilibrium part within the market. And that's what we're going to look at here. And this ultimately is the crux of microeconomics. I do understand that our study of economics is a little bit truncated and watered down. If you do take an economics course in college, very likely what you will do is you will be manipulating these different supply and demand curves. So imagine having like a word problem and ultimately having to decide, okay, so based on this situation, what is happening? Is the demand increasing? Is the demand decreasing? Is the supply increasing? Is the supply decreasing? Or both? And you're going to use graphic programs, graphic software to move and manipulate so you can move these around and they kind of lock and click into place. So looking at this cartoon, you see two Inuits individuals, and one is selling snow cones and one is just next to his igloo, and he says, "Trust me, Harold, it's not or demand, it's supply and demand." This guy has basically an infinite supply of snow to sell his snow cones. But unfortunately, it's freezing and no one really demands a snow cone. And so this guy is losing out here because he's not understanding that it's the concept of supply and demand. So one kind of quick story that I always enjoy is when you talk about the invention of the waffle cone. So it was 1896 Chicago World's Fair, and there's two guys standing next to each other. One is selling waffles with syrup, and the other guy is selling ice cream in a cup. Well, ultimately, because it's such a hot day, the guy selling ice cream in a cup, he runs out of cups. He still has ice cream left, and the guy selling waffles is doing terrible. He hasn't sold waffles all day long. So what does he do? He folds the waffle, you put the ice cream on top, and so ultimately the supply and demand, there was a change in the market and really led to this innovation where we all get to benefit. Now this balance. We talk about the definition of equilibrium in the market. This is the point at which the quantity demanded, as demonstrated by the red here, is equal to the quantity supplied. And then this is equilibrium. And when we talk about balancing the market, we will talk about that it will always balance itself. In laissez-faire economics, the self-interest in the market will allow the market to fix itself. If the demand is off, the demand will fix itself. If the supply is off, the supply will fix itself because of that self-interest. So what do we do when it's not at equilibrium? Well, we call it disequilibrium. And so don't overthink this, is basically where the quantity supplied is not equal to the quantity demanded. They don't match up. You would say that the market itself is in a state of disequilibrium. So a couple things that can cause the disequilibrium. One is excess demand. There's actually too much demand for what the quantity supplied can sustain. And so this is something that we're seeing with face masks and hand sanitizer and toilet paper. The demand for these goods right now is much greater than the demand that can be supplied. And then the opposite of this is the excess supply, where you just, you have too many things supplied and there's not enough demand for it. And so ultimately you're not going to sell as many items. And so what we look at, and this is what I mentioned before, is in a market economy, you will see that the market itself, the interaction between the buyers and sellers, they will push it back to the equilibrium from disequilibrium. If an item is too expensive and no one is buying it, the supplier will decrease the price of the item in an attempt to increase the demand. And so these two interactions, you have the consumer, you have the producer, and these different things will work together to push the market back to equilibrium. Real quick before I dive into that, one kind of political critique is Democrats are very much in favor of government interaction, meaning we can't always trust the interaction between buyers and sellers. Sometimes the government needs to step in, whereas Republicans are more in favor of this free market where we don't need to intervene. And this is a lot of what our President Trump, is currently doing with a lot of the handlings of the coronavirus. Is ultimately, yes, he's claiming the ultimate authority is the federal government, but as states, states are going to do what they need to do. It's not really the job for the government to step in. The market will equal itself out. Okay, a couple of other concepts related to these different things is one way the government can step in is they can bring in what's called a price ceiling. So think of at the top. So this is a maximum, whereas a price floor would be a minimum. So price ceiling, okay, maximum price that can legally be charged. And one example we see is with rent control. I'm not sure if this is currently true, but I know Mr. Bergstrom has lived in Santa Monica in a rent-controlled apartment, which means that the city of Santa Monica is only allowed to raise his rent a certain amount each year. And I know in other cities, like in LA County in general, I think you cannot raise it more than, I think, 15%. And so ultimately what we're looking at is a price control on rent is something that the government can step in. Now, the efficacy of this policy is definitely up for debate, because if you just say like something like LA, there's really nice places of LA, there's not so nice places of LA, and rent control can have an impact on the just great disparity that we see in that. On the inverse, or the inverse of this is with the price floors, and this is a minimum that is either paid for a good or for a service. And so something like minimum wage is a great example of a price floor. And so what this is saying is you have to pay your worker a minimum amount. And if you don't, that is against the law, and there's fines and things like that. So there's a state minimum wage, there's a federal minimum wage. But again, think of the attempt. This is an example of the federal government, state government, local government stepping in to make sure that there's a greater equality in here. And so oftentimes the intention of government intervention is to ensure that this equilibrium in the market, the balancing of the market, still benefits the consumer. Usually government interventions are protections for the consumers, not usually for the producers. Okay, great. So this one says, I have the small business says, hey, I have some good news and some bad news for you. The good, the Democrats want to increase minimum wage. Cool, man. And the bad, well, you're fired because I can't afford that. And so unfortunately, when you talk about something like minimum wage, politically, this will get you elected, talking about minimum wage. Economically, this may not be the most effective policy. And so what we see is it's an undue burden, in many opinions, to have an increased minimum wage, because the small business owner is thinking of their fixed and variable costs, and they can't produce as many items with this. So what do businesses do? Well, they innovate. And unfortunately, minimum wage has an unfortunate connection to an increase in automation, meaning you see more self-checkout at CVS and Vons and Albertsons and things like this, because the amount of money to pay, the cost to make an automated machine compared to the cost of paying a worker's minimum wage is difficult. And so it's much easier to do the automated pay. And if you really want to take this argument to the next step, this is where UBI comes in as a way. You get rid of minimum wage, you just have your universal basic income. Just some food for thought. So when we look at, efficiently allocating the resources, this is more on the producer's end. And so when you're producing something, because of the self-interest, you want to make as much money as possible. And that's the guiding principle. And because you want to make so much money, you're going to make sure that the resources you have are allocated properly. And so what we look at ultimately is in the market system, there's changing prices, which ensures that resources go to use to the uses of the consumers that value this the most highly. And so when you look at someone's demand, the consumer ultimately is going to want to pay the best price, and ultimately the resources themselves, they're going to ensure that the consumers that want them are the ones that are going to have them. And one more point about the resource allocation is, looking at this from a very theoretical standpoint, you would say that the market system itself makes sure that the resources go to the people that actually need them. And so what we're seeing now is an increase in the number of ventilators. And so the consumers, the hospitals, can take those ventilators and give them to the people that need them the most. Then you get into the other concerns, which would be more of a market problem. And market problems really are things that we talked about before a little bit when you talk about a market failure, where ultimately the things that we need are not produced. And ultimately this imperfect competition can really have an impact on the price as well. And so you could have shortages, which impact prices. But ultimately what we're looking at here with the market problem is more in general, how the actual, when the demand, the quantity demanded is different than the quantity supplied, these are the issues that occurs, the imperfect competition. And then you also have things like spillover costs. So spillover costs would be, okay, take the Sriracha company. They press their own chilies in Hawthorne, but it's very bad for the environment. So this is something that may have an impact on people purchasing Sriracha, but ultimately it doesn't make an impact in the price that the consumer, or excuse me, that the producer is paying to make sure that this product is produced. Now, ultimately, you could say that when there's market problems, when there's imperfect information, usually people will make bad decisions. So these are things like the Nigerian prince scam and just buying things on Wish and eBay and not really looking into it. And ultimately, you would say that in a market system, this is buyer beware. And sometimes the government will step in to impact this to make sure that people are well informed. And this is where you get things like health grade ratings on restaurants. Now, when you talk about a perfect competition, this is where you would say that the market is at equilibrium. And if we want to, as economists, go in and judge to see if there's perfect competition or ways that we can push it to perfect competition, we would look at things like many buyers and sellers. There's many people on both ends. And so you want lots of purchasers, you want lots of different suppliers or ways in which to participate in this. And this could be something where you can buy it online, you can buy it in person. There are different choices, different things that you can accessorize and things like that. So just the number of consumers and producers. And then also when there are no differences in the products that are sold by the different suppliers. So something like toilet paper. I mean, right now, toilet paper has issues in the market. There's an excess demand for toilet paper. But in general, there isn't a whole lot of difference in the different supplier. I mean, yeah, we could talk about softness of the toilet paper, but ultimately, they're very, very similar, the products, the range of products you could purchase at the store. The other thing that we see is buyers and sellers are perfectly informed into what's going on. So, for example, you take something like cigarettes. Okay, cigarettes says on the actual box, or if you buy like a vape pen or a Juul or something, it'll say that nicotine is an addictive drug. Nicotine causes addiction, and that is to create a more perfect competition, because the cigarette companies, they're not going to want to put that on there because they're not going to sell as many cigarettes. But the government is going to jump in to make sure there's perfect competition. So if you are going to choose to smoke, you are an informed buyer. You know the costs, the spillover costs, the health issues of purchasing that item. And then also understand that with a perfect competition is if you want to create your own company, you can create your own company. If your company runs out of money, well, you're just going to be kicked out of the market. And ultimately, you would call this free market entry and exit, that you can enter it in when you're going to make money, and then you'll leave it when you can't make money. Now, all of these items are very theoretical and things that we push for, but may not actually be things that we always see. Thank you so much for listening through this, guys. And if you have any questions, please let me know. And do make sure you have a good understanding of the key terms on this. This will demonstrate your greatest understanding of this, and look for those on the Google form.